The wind spoke of a coming storm. It was a language Silas understood better than the words of men. It soughed through the high pines that bordered his property, a lonely sound for a lonely place. He'd bought the land for that reason, for the silence that filled the spaces between the wind's whispers. He'd come here to let his own silence spread out and find its edges. The cabin was sturdy, built by a man who knew the bite of winter, but the old barn, 50 yards distant, was a skeleton. Its timbers groaned with each gust, a slow complaint against the inevitable. He was heading back from the creek line, axe resting on his shoulder, when a flicker of movement in the barn's shadowed maw caught his eye. It was not a skittish deer or a prowling coyote. It was something else, something that sought to be unseen. He stopped, his body still, a part of the landscape. He watched the deep square of blackness where the main door had once hung. The wind was a liar. It could make shadows dance and play tricks on a man's eyes. But his gut, a truer compass than any instrument, told him this was real. He shifted the axe in his grip, the worn hickory smooth against his palm. He did not call out. A man who called out into a space that should be empty was a fool looking for an answer he didn't want. He walked toward the barn, his steps measured, soundless on the bed of pine needles. The air grew thick with the smell of old hay, damp earth, and something else. Fear. It was a scent as sharp and metallic as fresh blood. He paused at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. Light filtered through the gaps in the roof, motes of dust dancing in the weak columns of gray. In the far corner, tucked behind a rusted threshing machine, the shadow moved again. It resolved itself into a shape, a woman. She was crouched low, her body a tight knot of desperation. In her arms, she cradled 2 small bundles, and in her free hand, pointed toward him, was the tarnished head of a pitchfork, its handle braced against the dirt floor. Her eyes were wide in a face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but they burned with a feral fire, the fire of a cornered thing protecting its young. He could see the slight tremble in the arm holding the pitchfork, but her gaze was unwavering. He saw her lips part, a dry, soundless gasp. He did not raise the axe. He did not take another step. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the wind that swept in behind him. He looked at her, then at the 2 impossibly small bundles she held so tight they seemed a part of her. Twins. He saw the rise and fall of their tiny forms. He saw the chapped skin of her knuckles, white around the pitchfork's handle. He saw everything, the flight, the terror, the fierce, hopeless love. He let the silence stretch, letting her see that he was not an aggressor. He was just a man. He took the axe from his shoulder, and with a slow, deliberate motion, drove its head into a low-hanging beam beside him. The thud was a punctuation mark, an end to a sentence of threat. He showed her his empty hands. The storm was closer now, the sky outside a bruised purple. The first fat drops of rain began to spatter on the tin patches of the roof, a slow, ominous drumbeat. He looked at the fragile shelter she had found, a place of splinters and rot, and then at the solid lines of his cabin where a hearth was cold but waiting. He met her eyes again, and for the first time in a long time, he used his voice for something other than a curse or a grunt of effort. The words were quiet, rough from disuse, but they carried across the space between them, a bridge over a chasm of fear. "You're safe now," he said. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving the axe buried in the beam. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps a test. He left the cabin door ajar, a silent invitation against the growing storm. Inside, the single room was sparse, almost monastic. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, a stone fireplace dominating one wall. It was the home of a man who owned things for their use, not for their comfort. He moved with an economy of motion, a man long accustomed to his own company. He knelt at the hearth, scraping out the old ash, laying a bed of tinder, and striking a flint. A spark caught, a tiny orange miracle in the gray light. He fed it splinters, then larger sticks, until a small, hungry fire began to lick at the logs. The warmth began to push back the chill, a living thing in the heart of the home. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. He took a loaf of bread from a tin box and a round of cheese, placing them on the table. He did not look toward the door. He gave her the dignity of her own decision. The rain came in earnest then, a torrential downpour that hammered the roof and streamed down the single glass window pane. The world outside was dissolving into a fury of wind and water. He stood by the window, looking out at the swaying trees, his back to the room. He heard it, a faint creak of the floorboards behind him. He did not turn. He heard the soft shuffle of exhausted feet, the tiny, muffled whimpers of the babies. She had come. He heard her stop just inside the door, the wet hem of her dress dripping onto the wood floor. The silence was thick with the storm and 1,000 unasked questions. He turned slowly. She stood there, drenched and shivering, still clutching the children to her chest as if they were the last anchor in a hostile world. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the fire, the table, the man who stood before her. She looked like a ghost, haunted and half-drowned. Her gaze fell on the food, and a flicker of something, a raw animal meat, crossed her face before she suppressed it. Her pride was a thin, tattered cloak, but she still wore it. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself," he said. It was not a request. He crossed to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed and lifted the lid. He pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He did not approach her. He laid it over the back of one of the chairs. He went back to the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate. He knew that any sudden action, any loud word, would send her fleeing back into the storm, a choice she might make even if it meant their doom. He felt like a man trying to gentle a wild horse. He remembered a story his father had told him about finding a wolf caught in a trap. It was dying, but it would still snap at any hand that came near, even a hand that meant to help. He felt that same energy from her now, a fierce, desperate, and righteous distrust of the world. He busied himself, pretending an interest in the fire, giving her space. He heard her move, a hesitant step toward the hearth. He heard her sink into the chair, a long shuddering sigh escaping her lips as the fire's warmth touched her. He did not look. He gave her the privacy of her relief. After a long while, he heard a new sound, the quiet, contented gurgle of a baby being fed. A peace, fragile as a butterfly's wing, had settled in the room. A week bled into the next. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured and clean. A cold snap followed, and the mornings were painted with a crystalline frost. A routine, unspoken and unnegotiated, began to form, weaving their separate lives into a shared existence. His name was Silas. Her name was Alara. They knew this not because they had spoken it, but because she had once whispered his name in a feverish dream, and he had heard one of the babies called Leo, the other Willow, and from there he had guessed hers. He would rise before the sun, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards a quiet signal. He would build up the fire, his back to her as she tended to the twins in the dim light. She had made a small, soft world for them on the blanket by the hearth. He would leave without a word, off to chop wood, check his trap lines, or mend the fences that marked the edges of his solitude. He was a man who understood things through his hands. He repaired the latch on the cabin door, making it stronger. He re-chaired one of the wobbling chairs. He found a small, broken cradle in the dusty loft, its rocker split. He spent an evening meticulously sanding down a new piece of wood, fitting it into place, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He left it by the hearth, and the next morning, Willow and Leo were sleeping in it, side by side. It was his first gift. She, in turn, claimed the domestic space. She found his meager supplies and began to transform them. The bread he baked was denser, richer. She found wild herbs near the creek and made a savory stew from the rabbits he brought back. She washed their few clothes in a bucket, the clean scent of lye soap, a new smell in the cabin. She was creating a home where there had only been a shelter. Her work was a silent thank you, a way of earning her keep in a currency of care. They rarely spoke. Their conversations were in gestures. He would leave a brace of skinned rabbits on the porch. She would leave a hot plate of food on the table for his return. She would leave a pile of his worn clothes by the door. He would find them later, mended with small, neat stitches. But in the quiet, they watched each other. She watched him when he thought she wasn't looking, saw the deep sadness that settled in his eyes when he stared into the fire. She saw the way his shoulders were always braced, as if for a blow. He watched her too. He saw the way she would sometimes freeze, her head cocked, listening for a sound only she could hear. He saw the fierce, almost painful love she poured into her children, a love that was her shield and her weapon. One night, Leo began to cry, a thin, pained wail that tore at the quiet. His small body was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Ilara's composure, so carefully maintained, began to crack. She rocked him, murmuring soft words, her face a mask of escalating panic. Silas watched from his corner. He saw her fear, a mirror of a memory he fought daily to keep buried. He got up. She flinched as he approached, her body instantly tensing, her arms tightening around the sick child. He stopped a few feet away. "Feverfew," he said, his voice low. "Down by the creek. It can break a fever." She stared at him, her eyes searching his for a trick, a lie. He held her gaze, his own steady. He was not offering a cure. He was offering a piece of his past, a sliver of knowledge learned in another life, for another child. The silence stretched. It was the moment the new rocker had been, the moment the axe had been left in the beam. A choice. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she acquiesced. She did not move from her spot, but she allowed him into her circle of fear. He had been granted passage. The rider appeared like a bad omen on the northern ridge, a stark black silhouette against the pale autumn sky. Ilara saw him first. She was outside, gathering the last of the hardy herbs that grew along the cabin's foundation. The sight of him, so distant yet so clear, sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She snatched up her basket and fled back inside, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She bolted the door Silas had repaired, her movements frantic. She grabbed the twins from their cradle, one under each arm, and backed into the darkest corner of the room, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. The careful peace of the last few weeks shattered like glass. Silas was splitting logs when he saw the rider. He didn't stop his motion. The axe came down, cleaving a round of oak with a clean, satisfying crack. But his body was coiled, every sense alert. He had known this was a possibility. The world was not as large as people thought, and tracks in the mud told stories. He set the axe down and walked, not toward the cabin, but directly toward the ridge line, his path intersecting the riders. He would meet this trouble away from the woman and her children. He moved with a purpose that was both calm and deeply menacing. The rider, a lanky man with a weasel's face, reined in his horse as Silas approached. He had a cocky, insolent air, the kind of man who enjoyed the fear he inspired in others. "That's a nice bit of smoke from that chimney," the rider said, his eyes flicking toward the cabin. Didn't know old man Hemlock had sold this place. Silas stopped about 10 feet away, his feet planted firmly. He said nothing. His silence was a wall. The rider shifted in his saddle, his confidence wavering slightly in the face of this quiet, unmovable man. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his tone a little less smug. "A woman. with 2 babes. Came this way. Silas's expression did not change. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were flat and hard. He let the man's words hang in the air and die. "This is my land," Silas said finally. The statement was not a conversation starter. It was a fact. Like a mountain or a river, the rider licked his lips. Maybe she passed through. The Colter family is mighty interested in her whereabouts. There's a reward. The name Colter hung in the air, venomous and ugly. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. So that was the name for her fear. "I've seen no one," Silas said. His voice was level, devoid of any emotion. It was a dismissal. The weasel-faced man hesitated, looking from the cabin to the implacable man in front of him. He was a scout, a dog sent to sniff things out, not a wolf meant for a fight. He saw no fear in Silas, and that, more than anything, unnerved him. He gave a curt, frustrated nod. "If you do," he spat, "the Colters will make it worth your while." He wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a gallop, disappearing back over the ridge. Silas stood there for a long time, watching the empty space where the man had been. The threat was no longer a ghost from Ilara's past. It was here. It had a name. He turned and walked back to the cabin. He didn't speak of the encounter when he went inside. He didn't need to. The terror in Ilara's eyes told him she already knew. That night, by the low light of the fire, he did not mend a fence or a chair. He took out his whetstone and began to sharpen the blade of his hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the room, a promise of violence to come. The visit from the Colter scout had changed the air in the cabin. The quiet, which had once been a space for healing, was now taut with unspoken tension. The fragile peace had been a temporary reprieve, a shared illusion, and now the harsh reality of their situation pressed in on them from all sides. Ilara's nightmares returned. Silas would wake in the deep of the night to the sound of her muffled cries, the ghosts of her past chasing her even in sleep. He would lie still on his cot, listening, his own ghost stirring in sympathy. The silence between them became heavier, weighted with the things they could not bring themselves to say. One evening, as the fire crackled and the twins slept soundly in their cradle, the weight became too much for her. She was darning one of his socks, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm, but her knuckles were white. "They won't stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had willingly broached the subject. Silas looked up from the piece of wood he was whittling. He waited. "My husband, Jacob. He wasn't like them," she continued, her eyes fixed on her needlework. "His father and his brothers, the Colters, they're different. They think everything is theirs to take. The land, the animals, the people." Her voice was flat, stripped of emotion, as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "When Jacob died, they said the farm was theirs. They said I was theirs. And the children." Her breath hitched, and she stopped. She did not need to finish the sentence. Silas could imagine the rest. The cruelty, the greed, the view of a woman and her children as nothing more than property, an inheritance to be claimed along with the livestock in the fields. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not say, "It will be all right." Such words were cheap and useless. Instead, he focused on the small thing in his hands. He made a delicate, careful cut with his knife, shaving away a sliver of pine. He worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scrape of his blade and the crackle of the fire. She thought he hadn't listened, that he had retreated back into his stony quiet. But then he spoke, his voice low and certain. "They will not take you," he said. It was not a promise. It was a verdict. It held the finality of a rock slide. He looked at her then, and his eyes were not empty or cold. They held a flicker of something ancient and fierce, a protective instinct that ran deeper than words. He had drawn a line in the dirt around the cabin, around her and her children, and he would defend it. Later that night, after she had retreated to her makeshift bed, he finished his carving. He had been working on it for days. It was a small, intricately detailed bird, a swallow with its wings swept back for flight. He ran his thumb over the smooth wood, a motion that was almost a caress. He placed it on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the fire, next to the cradle. It was a silent message, a symbol of a freedom he intended to protect. It was his answer to her unspoken fear, carved from a piece of his own broken silence. Autumn burned itself out in a final defiant blaze of color before yielding to the gray melancholy of early winter. The first snows came, light dustings at first, then a heavier blanket that muffled the world in a profound silence. The isolation that had once been Silas's solace now became their shared fortress. The cold drove them inward, forcing a proximity that was both a comfort and a challenge. They worked together, a synchronized team moving to the rhythms of survival. He taught her how to set snares for snowshoe hares, his instructions brief and direct, communicated more through gesture than speech. She, in turn, showed him how to render the fat for tallow, making candles that gave off a clean, steady light, pushing back the long, dark evenings. Their lives were a tapestry woven from these small, shared tasks. The cabin, once just his, was now theirs. Her touch was everywhere, in the neatly stacked firewood, the jars of dried herbs on the shelf, the soft deerskin she had sewn to cover the drafty window at night. His presence was in the solid feel of the repaired door, the constant supply of meat and wood, the silent vigilance he kept. One afternoon, as a pale sun struggled through the clouds, Silas sat by the fire, oiling the leather of his boots. Willow, now old enough to sit up on her own, was on the floor nearby, playing with the wooden swallow he had carved. She reached for his boot, her tiny hand patting the worn leather. He froze. He looked down at her curious, trusting face. She looked up at him and gave a wide, toothless grin, followed by a gurgle of pure, unadulterated laughter. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in the quiet solemnity of the cabin, that it struck him like a physical blow. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had long ago locked away. A smile tugged at the corner of his own mouth, a faint, rusty thing, but a smile nonetheless. Elara, who was kneading dough at the table, saw it. She saw the way his whole body softened for a fraction of a second. She saw the way the deep lines of grief around his eyes seemed to lessen. It was a moment of profound intimacy, more revealing than any touch or whispered secret. It was the sight of a man, broken by loss, finding a glimmer of light in the laughter of a child who was not his own. The unspoken thing between them shifted that day. It was no longer just about survival and protection. A fragile tendril of affection was taking root in the frozen ground of their lives. He was not just a protector, and she was not just a survivor. He was Silas. She was Elara. And in this small, snowbound cabin, surrounded by a hostile world, they were, for all intents and purposes, a family. He finished with his boots and picked up the small block of wood he had started on. He began to carve again, this time the shape of a wolf, strong and loyal, one for each child, a silent acknowledgment of the pack they had become. The thaw came in the middle of winter, a strange and unwelcome reprieve. The snow turned to slush, the ground to a sucking mud. It was bad weather for trapping, but good weather for traveling. Silas knew they would come. The Colters were not men to let an insult go unanswered. He spent his days preparing, not with frantic energy, but with a grim, methodical calm. He reinforced the window shutter. He stacked firewood by the door, not just for warmth, but to create a barrier. He checked the edge on his axe, the balance of his knife. He was a man preparing for a harvest of violence. Elara watched him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She did not ask what he was doing. She knew. She busied herself with her own preparations. She boiled water, tore strips of clean cloth for bandages, and sharpened the small kitchen knife until it was razor keen. She was not a passive damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a survivor, and she would fight for her children with the same feral intensity as a mother bear. The day they came was gray and damp. The air was heavy, promising more snow. A dog barked somewhere down the valley, a frantic warning sound. Silas was outside, securing a loose roof shingle, when he heard it. He straightened, his eyes scanning the tree line. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the mist-shrouded pines. The Colters. They were not alone this time. The scout from before was with them. Silas didn't run for the cabin. He stood his ground, a solitary figure in the muddy yard. He wanted the fight to happen out here, away from the cradle, away from the hearth. He wanted their violence to die in the mud, not on the floorboards of his home. "Silas!" Alara's voice was sharp from the doorway. He glanced back, saw her standing there, her face pale but her jaw set. She held an old, heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Bar the door." The lead rider, a big, bearded man with cruel eyes, the father, Silas presumed, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's him, the one who thinks he can stand in the way of family business." He dismounted, as did his 2 sons, brutish copies of their father. They spread out, flanking him. "We've come for what's ours," the father snarled. "The woman, the brats. They carry the Colter name." "She's not a thing to claim," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly weight. "And this is my land. Leave." The father spat on the ground. "This land won't do you no good when you're buried in it." He lunged. The fight was not a brawl. It was a brutal, efficient storm. Silas moved with a speed and ferocity that belied his quiet nature. He used the terrain, the mud, his own body as a weapon. He sidestepped the father's rush, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a crack of bone. One son came at him with a knife. Silas disarmed him with a fluid twist, the man screaming as his wrist snapped. The fight was fast, punchy, and ugly. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a man who clearly knew how to fight and how to finish a fight. But there were 3 of them. As he fought off one son, the other circled behind him, brandishing a heavy club. Just as the man swung, the cabin door flew open. Alara was there, her face a mask of pure rage. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy iron skillet with all her might. It spun through the air like a discus and caught the second son square in the side of the head. He dropped like a stone, unconscious. The distraction was all Silas needed. He drove his elbow into the throat of the man he was fighting, sending him staggering back, gasping for air. The father, seeing his sons defeated and his hired man cowering by the horses, roared in fury and charged Silas again. Silas met him head on. The collision was like 2 bulls meeting, but Silas was quicker. He sidestepped, tripped the larger man, and sent him crashing face first into the mud. The fight was over. Silas stood, breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding. He was bruised, and a deep cut on his arm was bleeding freely, but he was standing. The Colters were broken and humiliated in the mud. He looked at Alara, still standing in the doorway, her chest heaving, the fire of a warrior in her eyes. The threat had been met, and they had met it together. The aftermath was silent, save for the moans of the defeated men and the steady drip of rain from the eaves. Silas stood over the elder Colter, who was struggling to push himself out of the mud. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a final blow. He simply looked at him with cold, hard eyes. "Get them and go," Silas said. His voice was flat, final. "If you ever come back to this mountain, I will not let you leave it." The threat was plain, unadorned, and utterly believable. The father, his face a mask of mud and hate, glared at Silas. then at Alara, who had not moved from the doorway. He saw no fear in either of them, only a grim, unified resolve. Defeated, he staggered to his feet, roused his groaning sons, and they mounted their horses, a broken and shamed procession. They rode away without a backward glance, swallowed by the mist from which they had come. The scout had already vanished. As soon as they were gone, the adrenaline that had sustained them drained away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Silas looked down at the gash on his forearm. It was deeper than he'd thought, bleeding sluggishly, staining the sleeve of his shirt a dark crimson. He swayed slightly, the world tilting for a moment. Silas. Alara was at his side, her voice soft but firm. The iron skillet was gone, replaced by a deep, immediate concern. She put a hand on his good arm to steady him, her touch a small point of warmth in the cold, damp air. Inside, now. He let her guide him back into the cabin, sinking heavily into the chair by the fire. The roles were now completely reversed. He was the wounded, and she was the caretaker. She moved with a quiet efficiency that mirrored his own. She barred the door, then came to him with a basin of hot water and the clean cloths she had prepared. She said nothing about the fight, nothing about the Colters. The time for that was over. The time for healing had begun. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. Her touch was gentle but sure. As she worked, she pushed back his sleeve, and then the sleeve of his undershirt, to better see the extent of the damage. And there, in the flickering firelight, she saw them, the scars. His back and shoulders were a road map of old violence, a lattice of pale, raised lines that spoke of a past far more brutal than the fight he had just endured. They were not the marks of an accident. They were the marks of a whip. She stopped for a barest fraction of a second, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at his face, but he was staring into the fire, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. She did not ask. She did not need to. The scars told their own story, a silent testament to a suffering he had never spoken of. They explained the silence, the watchfulness, the coiled readiness that lived just beneath his calm exterior. He was not just a man grieving a lost family. He was a man who had survived something terrible. She lowered her eyes and continued her work, her touch even gentler than before. Her quiet, methodical care was its own form of communication. It said, "I see you. I see your pain. You are safe here." He, in turn, did not pull away. He accepted her touch, her care. It was a surrender, not of strength, but of the solitude that had been his armor for so long. In that small, silent act of tending, a new, deeper level of trust was forged between them, stitched together with needle, thread, and an ocean of unspoken understanding. He recovered slowly. The wound on his arm was clean, but deep, and it left him with a stiffness that hampered his work. For days he was confined to the cabin, a reluctant patient under Alara's watchful eye. The forced inactivity was a trial for him, but it created a new kind of space between them. A quiet, contemplative space, filled not with tension, but with a comfortable domestic silence. He would sit by the fire, sharpening his knives, or carving the small wooden wolf, while she moved about the cabin, tending the babies, cooking, her presence a constant, soothing rhythm. The fight had settled something between them. The external threat for now was gone, and in its absence, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. One evening, as a heavy snow fell outside, blanketing the world in white, he finally spoke of it. Not of the Colters, but of the life before, the life that had taught him how to be silent. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low and raspy. He was staring into the flames, the small wooden wolf held loosely in his hand. Alara, who was rocking the cradle with her foot, went still. She did not look at him, sensing that his gaze was turned inward, toward a place he rarely visited. "Her name was Anna," he continued. "We had a son, Daniel." He spoke the names as if they were fragile things, easily broken. We weren't here. We were south of here, trying to farm a piece of land that didn't want to be farmed. He paused, and the only sound was the hiss of the fire and the soft breathing of the twins. It wasn't a fight that took them. It was a fever, the kind that comes in the winter and doesn't leave. It took Daniel first. He was so small. A muscle worked in his jaw. Anna, she followed him a week later. It was like the light just went out of her. I couldn't do anything. I just watched. He fell silent, the weight of that admission filling the room. It was not a story of heroic struggle or tragic battle. It was a simple, brutal story of helplessness. The ultimate failure of a man who saw himself as a protector. It explained everything. The purchase of this lonely land. The retreat from the world. His silence was not an absence of feeling, but a monument to a grief so vast it had consumed his words. He had come here not to live, but to quietly cease to exist alongside his memories. After that, he said, his voice barely audible, I couldn't stand the quiet of that house. So I came here, looking for a different kind of quiet, an empty quiet. He finally looked up from the fire and met her eyes. His were filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. He had shared the source of his deepest pain. He had made himself vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Alara looked at him, her own heart aching in sympathy. She thought of her own loss, her own flight. They were two sides of the same coin of grief. She didn't offer words of comfort. She knew, better than anyone, how hollow they could sound. Instead, she simply nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of his pain. I hear you, the gesture said. I understand. And in that shared, sorrowful understanding, the last of the walls between them dissolved into nothing. He was no longer just the stoic protector, and she was no longer just the resilient survivor. They were Silas and Alara, two broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to start mending each other. With the Colters gone and Silas's past finally given voice, a profound peace settled over the cabin. It was a fragile peace, born of violence and grief, but it was real. Winter held the mountain in its icy grip, isolating them completely. The deep snow that had once seemed like a threat now felt like a protective embrace, cutting them off from the rest of the world and sealing them in their own small universe. Their days fell into a comfortable, established rhythm. He was stronger now, his arm nearly healed, and he resumed his work outside, but his absences were shorter. He never strayed too far from the sound of the cabin, from the life within it. He would return in the late afternoon, covered in snow, to the smell of baking bread and the sight of Alara sitting by the fire with the twins. She would look up and smile, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. The sight of it was worth more to him than anything he had ever owned. This was the calm before a different kind of storm, the quiet rebuilding that happens after the battle is over. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. They talked more now, not in long conversations, but in small, meaningful exchanges. He would tell her about the tracks he found in the snow of Fox, a wolf pack passing in the night. She would tell him about Leo's first tooth, or the funny face Willow made that morning. They were the small, mundane details that build a life, the tiny threads that weave a family together. He finished carving the second animal, the wolf, and gave it to Leo. He now had two small figures on the mantel, a swift swallow for his daughter, and a loyal wolf for his son. They were not his children by blood, but in the quiet moments when he would rock their cradle, or let one of them grasp his finger, the distinction no longer seemed to matter. One evening, he found her mending the shirt that had been torn in the fight. She had carefully, almost invisibly, stitched the gash in the fabric. He stood behind her, watching her small, precise movements in the firelight. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "It's a good shirt," she replied. "It's a waste to throw it out." It wasn't about the shirt. They both knew that. It was about mending what was broken. It was about her care for him, a quiet declaration stitched into the cloth. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently rested it on her shoulder. She stopped sewing, but didn't pull away. It was the first time he had touched her with simple, unadorned affection. It was not the touch of a protector steadying a victim, or a patient accepting care. It was the touch of a man reaching out for a connection. She leaned into it slightly, a silent acceptance. In that moment, a new future began to feel possible. A future beyond the next winter, beyond the next threat. A future where this small cabin, built for one man's solitude, might be a home for a family. The fire burned bright, the twins slept soundly, and outside the snow fell, covering the scars on the land, offering the promise of a clean new beginning when the spring thaw finally came. The final confrontation, when it came, was not heralded by riders on a ridge or a dog's warning bark. It began with a silence that was wrong. It was late winter, the season of long shadows and brittle cold. Silas was checking a snare line near the creek, a quarter-mile from the cabin, when he felt it. The woods had gone unnaturally still. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. It was the hush that falls when a predator is near. His hand went to the hatchet on his belt. He moved back toward the cabin, not running, but with a fluid ground-eating stride, keeping to the cover of the trees. He saw them as he crested the last rise. 4 men, moving in a crouched, predatory line toward the cabin. The Colters had returned. The father, his 2 sons, and a new man, a stranger with a rifle. They were not on horseback this time. They had come on foot, through the deep woods, like wolves stalking a sheepfold. They thought him gone. They thought to catch the woman and children, alone and unprotected. A cold, clean rage filled Silas. Not the hot rage of a brawl, but the icy fury of a man defending his home. He was not the same man they had fought in the mud. That man had been fighting to protect a refugee. This man was fighting to protect his family. Inside, Alara had also sensed the wrongness. Perhaps it was a mother's instinct, a primal sense of danger to her young. She had just put the twins down for their nap when a shadow passed the window. She peered out, her heart seized. The Colters. She didn't scream. Her panic was cold and sharp. She moved with purpose. She barred the door and the window shutter, plunging the room into semi-darkness. She grabbed the heavy poker from the hearth, its weight a small comfort in her hand. She backed away from the door, placing herself between it and the cradle. Her face was a pale, determined mask in the gloom. The first blow came against the door, the heavy thud of a shoulder. "Alara!" The father's voice was a guttural roar. "We know you're in there. Open this door. We've come to take you home." Another heavy blow, and the wood splintered. Silas moved like a ghost through the trees, circling to come at them from their flank. The man with the rifle was their greatest threat. He had to be dealt with first. As the Colter sons threw their weight against the door again, Silas broke from the tree line. The rifleman, startled, turned to bring his weapon to bear. He was too slow. Silas was on him in 3 strides, the hatchet a blur of motion. It was brutal and swift. The man fell without a sound. Silas didn't pause. He flowed toward the 2 sons, who were still battering the door, their backs to him. He was a storm of righteous violence. The fight was a whirlwind of desperate, ugly motion, but it was short. He was driven by a purpose they could not comprehend. He fought not for greed or for vengeance, but for the life he had found inside that cabin. Inside, the doorframe began to crack. A sliver of light appeared. Alara knew it would not hold. With a final desperate heave, the door burst inward, and the elder Colter stumbled into the room. He saw her, silhouetted against the fire, the poker held like a spear. He grinned, a broken, triumphant leer. There you are." But as he took a step toward her, the sound of the fight outside abruptly stopped. There was only the wind. Colter hesitated, turning his head. In that moment of distraction, Silas appeared in the broken doorway behind him. He was breathing hard, his face grim, his knuckles bloody, but he was alone. Colter stared, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning terror. He was trapped. He looked from the implacable man in the doorway to the furious woman by the hearth. He had not come to a helpless sheepfold. He had walked into a den of wolves. The confrontation was over. The threat was not just defeated. It was annihilated. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, fat flakes that drifted down to cover the violence that had transpired. They would cover the bodies. They would cover the tracks. They would blanket the world in a clean, white shroud, granting a kind of peace. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the aftermath of terror. The elder Colter lay still upon the floor. Silas stood in the ruined doorway, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on Ilara. She had not moved. She still stood guard by the cradle, the heavy poker held in a white-knuckled grip. Her eyes were wide, locked on him, ensuring he was real, that he was whole. He took a step into the room, then another. He walked past the fallen man without a glance. He stopped in front of her. Gently, he reached out and took the poker from her hand, her fingers so stiff he had to uncurl them one by one. He set it quietly back on the hearth. Then he looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fierce warrior who had stood ready to defend her children to the death. He saw the resilient survivor who had fled from a life of cruelty. He saw the woman who had mended his shirt, tended his wounds, and brought light back into his desolate life. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking away a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's over. You're safe." She leaned into his touch, a long, shuddering breath escaping her. The tension drained out of her body, and the tears she had refused to shed finally came, silent and hot. He did not pull away. He simply held her, a quiet, solid presence in the dim light of the cabin. They stood there for a long time, two solitary souls who had found their harbor in each other. The fire crackled in the hearth. The twins slept on, oblivious, in their cradle. The broken door let in the cold air and the soft, falling snow, but inside, a new warmth was blooming. A warmth built not of logs and flame, but of shared peril, of profound trust, and of a love that had grown, quiet and stubborn, in the most desolate of places. The long winter was ending. Spring was coming. So here our story draws to a close. It began in a storm, with a man steeped in silence and a woman hunted by fear. It ends in the quiet of a snowfall, with the promise of a new season. The cabin on the mountain, once a monument to one man's grief, has been transformed. Its walls, which were meant to keep the world out, have instead become the fortress for a new one. The hearth, once cold, now burns as the heart of a home. This tale was not one of grand battles or epic quests, but of the small, brave acts that forge a life, the mending of a cradle, the sharing of a meal, the carving of a wooden bird, the quiet tending of a wound. These are the things that rebuild a broken world, one small human gesture at a time. We have seen how a family is not always a thing of blood, but can be a thing of choice, a pact of protection and care made between wounded souls. We have seen how a man who had lost his words could find his voice again in the defense of others, and how a woman who had lost her home could build a new one with her own hands and heart. Before you go, think on this. What is a home, if not the place where our deepest scars are not hidden in shame, but seen and accepted without question? And what is a family, if not the safe harbor we build together, a fortress of trust in a merciless world?